Thank you everyone for coming today and the warm welcome and for providing food. It's always nice to get fed before I start a presentation. So as he indicated, I'm from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and I'm here as part of the Patient-Centered Outcomes research funding that the institution received as part of their R24. And this is an institutional development, training development grant, a very substantial grant that the institution was awarded. And as part of this site visit, I was asked to provide a presentation on potentially other funding opportunities that might be of interest to you, some tips on how to submit successful applications. But as someone who has been on the other side, so I was on faculty at the University of Michigan and submitted grants as part of my program of research, I'm also going to present to you my perspective from where you're sitting too. So the information that I wish I had known when I was in your shoes before I got on the inside and could no longer apply for these grants. But now that I'm in the inside, it's like, oh, I really want this grant. I have to temper. So how many of you have applied for federal funding, whether it's NIH or AHRQ? Okay, so quite a few of you. How many of you are here because you want to learn more about how to identify funding and learn some tips on how to successfully submit applications? Okay, so that's almost everybody. So if there's other elements that you want me to address, your primary purpose and objective of being here, please let me know. I want this presentation to be really interactive. I know typically these sessions that are held here, you wait to the end for questions and answers, but for this particular one, I want you to interrupt me. I won't know that this information is useful to you unless you ask questions or ask for additional information. This presentation is also in segments, and so if you have questions on one portion of the segment, if you don't get the answer, it's going to make the rest of the presentation a little bit confusing. So stop me and ask your questions along the way. I promise I won't bite. So the primary objectives for this presentation are identified here. We'll go through each of these sections as part of the presentation, and again, please stop me if you have any questions. So the first is the overview of AHRQ. And this is actually one of the most important pieces, and it lends itself well to be the first element that we talk about because it's sort of the starting point, but it's also the most important piece. So when you think about funding, you need to think about who are you going to submit your application to, and is it a good match? And the first place you should start is the mission statement. So is their mission in congruence with what I'm trying to achieve as part of my research program of research? And so as you can see, this is AHRQ's new mission. We have a fairly new director, although he's been in place for a while. And as part of his transition at AHRQ, we revised our mission statement. And the element that I'm most excited about is the addition of the word equitable. That wasn't in our previous mission statement, and yet it was always a priority of the agency, and that is equitable care. And I always provide links at the bottom of my slides, so you can always go back, and these slides will be available to you. AHRQ also has some new priorities, and there's 4 primary new priorities and the website to obtain additional information. So improve healthcare quality, to make healthcare safer, increase accessibility to healthcare, and improve healthcare affordability, efficiency, and cost transparency. Again, this is really important fundamental information. So when you think about what are the specific aims and the objectives of your proposed research study, you need to ask yourself, do they fit within one of the priorities of the agency? Because when we think about funding, we think about whether or not your proposal fits within our mission and our priorities. And so there's more information about each of these. I truncated the information. Please visit the website. We also have special emphasis notices, and these special emphasis notices give you insight into specific areas that we would like to focus on, areas where we really would like to see more applications on. And so I'm going to take a moment here and jump out of the slides. I already have it up. And so on our website, we have a listing of our special emphasis notices. And if you'll notice, the top 4 are the most recent ones that we have posted. And a few conversations prior to this presentation with folks, there are 2 that I want to draw, or 3 that I want to draw your attention to. The first is the special emphasis notice focused on our interest in research and healthcare insurance coverage, access, and affordability. The second one is related to our interest in research on healthcare delivery system, affordability, efficiency, and quality. And then the third one I want to highlight is our interest in patient-centered outcomes research career development awards. So essentially what we're saying is, please send us your applications in these areas. In addition to meeting your research related to our mission and priorities, we really want applications specific to these pieces. And I'm going to click on one just so you can see what they look like. It's just a generic form that provides this information and goes into some detail in terms of what we are specifically looking for. And then with all of our announcements, there's always a contact person. So you can always reach out to them to obtain a clarifying information about the intention of that announcement. So let's go back to our slides. So now let's move into contracts. And many of you are thinking, why are we going to talk about contracts? I'm here for my research funding. Well, there's actually a lot of contracts that are focused on research. As federal funding for research dollars decreases, there's also opportunities for you to consider funding through contracts, such as systematic reviews or special projects that we need to have completed that we want to outsource to researchers who can conduct that research. And so I provide you with this link as an opportunity to explore contracts that may be of interest and that are available to you. This web link provides you all the contracts in the federal government, but there's a searchable option in there so you can focus on healthcare or focus on a clinical topic that is most interest to you, or a methodology, or a variety of different ways that you can explore that particular website. The next section, and this is probably why most of you are in this room, and that is in terms of our training grants. So the goal of our training grant is to continue to foster the growth, dissemination, and translation of health services research. How many of you have had a training grant? Okay, so my career was launched by a training grant with subsequent additional training grants, and I could not have been successful in my research without these training grants. And so as someone who has been the recipient, I cannot emphasize how critical and important these training opportunities are. And so we're really trying to foster the next generation of researchers to actively engage in workforce and knowledge production. So navigating through AHRQ's website. So you say, I'm interested in a training grant. I want to explore what's available. How do I find the current training grants? One of the best ways is to go to our website. We have a really nice, seamless website to find information that you're looking for. And I color-coded the arrows in the steps that I'm going to explain to you, starting in a rainbow, red. So when you go to our homepage, you can click on the Funding and Grants tab. When you get to the Funding and Grants tab, it will list all of our grants, both PAs and RFAs. Next, I want to draw your attention to the orange arrow, and that's related information. It's highlighted right there on the special emphasis notices, which I just took you to. I clicked on that piece of the website where you can find the listing of those emphasis notices. The yellow arrow is on the sidebar. This page right here tells you every single grant opportunity that's available. If you want to only focus on training and education grants that are available, clicking on that link by the yellow arrow will take you specifically to there. The green arrow then is focused on the sign up grant announcement email updates. So if we have a grant funding opportunity that's going to be posted, sometimes we'll alert you to that to give you a heads up to start to prepare. When we release a new funding announcement, we will send an email through that if you sign up to alert you to that. The other thing that's really, really important is if you are preparing a grant application, sometimes we release special announcements related to that funding opportunity. And you want to make sure that you're aware of any changes or updates to that announcement as you prepare your application, in addition to other information. So ongoing training awards, here are some examples. Again, that's from the website. We have the NERSA program, we have the dissertation grants. And I want to speak briefly about the dissertation grants in that we're really unique at AHRQ in that we're the only agency in HHS that offers dissertation grants. This is a really outstanding opportunity for health services researchers. It's similar to the NERSA program, so it provides training funds, it provides funds for your research, it covers tuition. It's a really nice all-encompassing opportunity for folks to consider. And then we have career development awards also. So one of the examples of our training grants is the K08. And this one might be, I chose this one because I think that it might be of most interest to this particular group. And this is the Mentor Clinical Scientist Award. As you can see, the audience, one thing that's really unique and wonderful about AHRQ is that we focus not only on just doctoral degrees, such as PhDs, but also clinical doctorate degrees to train in health services research. And I listed here the level of effort and duration and level of support. If you go to the actual funding announcement, you will see additional information and details. We also have very specific P-Core training grants. And these P-Core training grants are from the P-Core Trust Fund as part of the Affordable Care Act. And these focus on applying P-Core methods to CER. And probably one of the most common questions I receive when people are considering this type of funding is what is the difference between CER and P-Core? And then how do they come together? And so I'm not going to read these definitions to you. These slides will be available to you. But I wanted to provide these definitions for you because when you consider writing your application, you want to make sure that you utilize these definitions. Not that we need you to provide them to us, but that when you consider the design and methods of your study that you're proposing, that we're talking the same language, that you're using the same definition for comparative effectiveness research as we are, and that you're using the same definition for P-Core as we are. So a common question that I receive is differences and similarities between AHRQ and P-Core. I actually stole this slide from Joe Selby. He had presented at the National Advisory Council meeting for AHRQ, and he had created the slide. I added the little cartoon. I like a little humor. It said, "Let me know if you want to know why I'm here." That's the patient trying to tell their clinician, and that to me that sort of highlights P-Core. As a clinician, we go in and we do what we need to for the patient, and sometimes we forget, oh, why are you here? What's important to you? So I thought that was a nice little vignette to put there. So AHRQ and P-Core. P-Core is strictly focused on P-Core, right? Patient-centered outcomes research. They have a mandate from Congress as far as the Affordable Care Act and what they need to do and how they need to do it. AHRQ, on the other hand, is an agency within HHS. We have a component of P-Core, but we have many other elements of AHRQ, including, as was described earlier today, the Effective Healthcare Program, the Eisenberg Center, the Prevention Guidelines, Clinical Guideline Clearinghouse, our amazing national databases, MEPS, HCUP, and CAPS, along with many other elements to our agency. So P-Core training strategy is really focused on the training and development of new researchers in P-Core and P-Core methodologies applied to CER. We also provide bridge career support for emerging researchers. And a really unique and important element is the retooling for mid to senior level researchers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is really a nice addition to the P-Core funding opportunities. And that's someone who is a mid or senior level researcher who has been doing comparative effectiveness research in a particular topic their entire career, but doesn't have the P-Core piece and wants to receive the training and the experience in P-Core. There's research dollars, training dollars available to these faculty to get the P-Core elements and to have a P-Core CER research project that is funded. We also have, the last one is increased capacity at emerging institutions, which is the R24 that this institution received. So some examples of our current P-Core training awards. Again, you can go to our website to learn more. This is just a small snippet. We have a listing of others. You can read through them to identify which ones are most applicable to you and are best option. So as one particular example, again, returning back to the mid to senior level researcher, the P-Core K18, and that's to develop development in CER methods specific to P-Core and applying those P-Core methods to CER. It can range from 6 months to 2 years, again, providing substantial support for your research and your training related to your goals and objectives. So moving on to research grants. So we have training grants, and then we have research grants. The research grants are like your R01s, R21s. Again, going back to AHRQ's website to navigate through the system, starting with the red arrow, going to our homepage and clicking on Funding and Grants, and then clicking on Requests for Applications. So there's two differences. We have Requests for Applications, or RFAs, and then we have Program Announcements, PAs. And I provide this slide so you have an understanding of the difference between the two. The main difference is that for an RFA, it's a one-time opportunity. We accept applications one time. We're going to identify the best applications and fund them. There's not going to be another opportunity to resubmit for funding later on. A program announcement, on the other hand, is an ongoing funding announcement in which you have opportunity to resubmit. So say you submit an application, you get a mediocre score, or you're triaged, meaning you do not receive a score, but you want to resubmit to be considered again. You edit your application and then you resubmit it as part of that funding announcement, that program announcement, and you're rescored again. A new rule as of last year that's applicable to AHRQ and NIH is that there's unlimited resubmissions. It used to be that you can only resubmit once. Now you can resubmit as many times as you would like. So some examples of current FOAs. We currently do not have any RFAs posted, but again, signing up on that email alert will let you know when new ones are posted. For our program announcements, we have some R18s that I listed up here that might be of interest, in addition to others. The website has a long list of opportunities that are available. So let's go into the application process. And this is the piece where I wish I had some of this information on the outside before I got into the inside and was writing, before I was writing grants. So your application to AHRQ actually goes to NIH. We contract with NIH to process your application. From there it goes to AHRQ, and then we assign it to a study section. And if it does not have a specific program officer identified in the funding announcement, we will also assign you a program officer at that time. The review typically occurs 3 to 4 months after the application has been received. Funding decisions are made 1 to 3 months later, and if voted favorably for funding, it undergoes a review by AHRQ Grants Management after the funding meeting. And again, there's resubmission opportunities that are unlimited for PAs and none for RFAs simply because it's a one-time announcement. So when you submit your application will be assigned to 3 reviewers. You'll have a primary reviewer and 2 additional reviewers. Those 3 reviewers will thoroughly read, review, and score your application. As part of that process, they will collectively have a discussion at the funding meeting about your application with the entire review team. So there's a variety of folks who will be at the review meeting in addition to your 3 reviewers. Your 3 reviewers will have a discussion at this meeting. They will present your application, the pros, cons, strengths, limitations to all of the reviewers, and then collectively as a group they will score your application. And I include this slide just because I've had questions in the past about the criteria for the selection of peer reviewers. And these are some of the areas that we focus on when determining who to have as a reviewer for study sections. And we also receive questions about scoring. So your 3 individual reviewers will score independent of each other. So when they're at home reviewing your grant application, they fill out the form and then they give you preliminary scores for each of the core criteria: significance, investigator qualifications, innovation approach, and environment. And then as part of that, they then upload it, and then collectively those 3 reviewers can read each other's comments and scores to start to formulate where they want to focus for their discussion as part of the funding or the review meeting. And so that you can see the score here, an overall impact score of a 9-point scale. This is a nice handout that we give to all our reviewers, especially at the review meeting, in determining how they want to score a particular application. Obviously, a 1 is the best, where 9 being the poorest. And you obviously want a lower score to be more competitive for potentially funding. So a really important point to make when developing your research proposal is to address two key areas, and this is overall impact versus the significance. So what is the significance of this? Why is this important? That's the question that we want you to answer. The overall impact refers to, if you are funded, what is the potential impact of your research? And a lot of times our applications do not distinguish between the two, and so we want to emphasize, and that's why I provided definitions and questions to emphasize the importance of addressing these two pieces. So your application really needs to address some key areas: the who, when, how, why, what, and where. So why are we doing this? What problem are we solving? Is this actually useful? Are we adding value? Will this change behavior? Is there an easier way? What's the opportunity cost? And is it really worth it? The so what. At the end of the day, what is the so what? Why should we care? Why is this linked to AHRQ's mission and priorities? Why should we fund this? Making the case for why this research is important. So what happens as part of your process, your grant application process, is that at the end you will receive a summary statement. The summary statement, for the most part, is broken into two parts. The first part is a summary of what was discussed and the conclusions at the review meeting. So this is between the three reviewers when they got together, along with the collective group of reviewers, and your final score. The second part represents the three individual reviewers' comments and scores on each of the elements as part of the core criteria. The reviewers do not change this piece after they submit it to us. So a lot of times a question that I'll receive from someone who receives their summary statement is, well, I don't understand. In the summary, the first piece, it says that I had excellent, let's say, methods on collecting qualitative data, but I noticed later on in the document that it indicated that I needed to strengthen it. And that's confusing to me, because how can it be good and need to strengthen at the same time? Well, typically what happened is that one particular reviewer felt that it needed to be strengthened, but as part of their conversation at the review meeting, determined that, well, maybe it is a strength, and I was looking at it from different perspective. They had a really engaging conversation about the methods of the qualitative piece, and collectively as a group determined that indeed that it was a strength. So considering, you know, what that information came from and the timing is really important as you move forward. So I felt like I skipped one. Yep. So the summary statement contains all of these pieces: priority score, budget recommendations, appropriate human subjects protection, administrative notes. All of these elements are really useful for you as an applicant in understanding sort of what were the thoughts of the reviewers as they were reviewing your application. So what determines which awards are made? It's not just your score. So you'll have a score that you will receive, but there are many other elements that are considered. So scientific merit obviously is one of the most important elements, and this is reflected in your score. So the significance and originality, your overall impact, your methods, having really strong methods, the qualifications of the investigator, and the environment. So if you're a new investigator, brand spanking new, and you're applying for an R01, there may be some question about your capacity to actually conduct the research, and the recommendation may be to start with a training grant. So there's this identification of whether you're qualified for the type of funding announcement that you have applied for. The same thing for environment. Do you have the resources in place at your institution to ensure that you will be successful? If you have a really strong qualitative research component, but you don't have qualitative experts in your institution, that may not be a good match. We also have many program considerations. So is this responsive to AHRQ's mission and priorities? Is this something that we are focused on right now? Now, what I want to emphasize here is that AHRQ is not focused on clinical topics. NIH, their institutes have specific silos of clinical topics. We're focused on health services research. And so someone who submits a grant on HPV, as we were discussing earlier, will be reviewed with others who may submit a grant on cardiovascular disease. We don't have individual institutes with AHRQ that are focused on clinical topics. Therefore, our funding announcements are not typically specific to a clinical topic. Now, there are exceptions. AHRQ collaborated with PCORI on a large funding announcement focused on uterine fibroids. So occasionally you will see funding announcements that are specific to clinical topics, but for the most part, they are general. Other program considerations: that it's not duplicative to other AHRQ-funded projects. So if you're proposing a project that we're already funding, you know, there has to be a really strong case of why we would fund a second one. There would have to be something really unique related to that. The inclusion of priority populations. Priority populations meaning predominantly our vulnerable population: women, children, elderly, rural, inner city. And there's a wonderful website or page on AHRQ's website that goes through all of those priority populations and vulnerable populations. And it's really important that you integrate that into your application. The anticipated impact of the research. So we got the so what, so what's going to happen if we fund this? What is the anticipated impact? What's the bang for the buck? So if we give you a $5 million grant, what are you going to be able to deliver on? And then geographic distribution. We want to make sure that our funding is spread across the entire United States and is not specific to any particular region of the area. And then one of the biggest areas, which you will read in every single funding announcement, is the availability of funds. So at the end of the day, if there's not funds, we can't fund you. That's probably the biggest element of being able to be funded. So some key tips and points that I want to point out as part of the process to ensure your success. And I cannot emphasize enough the need to talk with your agency program officer, whether it's at NIH or AHRQ, wherever you're seeking funding. And this is something that I did not know, right? So prior to coming to AHRQ, when I was submitting grants, I never contacted my program officer, even though I knew who this person was. In some way, I was terrified because this is this person at NIH who has all this power, and there's in this abyss, and they're probably bombarded with lots of requests and questions. And you know, I don't want to sound stupid, because if I sound stupid, will that impact how they perceive my research project? You know, I'm just thinking of all these potential scenarios. Well, at the end of the day, you know, then I come into AHRQ, and there's people who contacted me, and I thought, wow, that's a novel idea. That's a great idea, because their questions helped to guide their proposal in the sense that they made sure that it was responsive to AHRQ's mission, responsive to the priorities, responsive to the funding announcement. And they received that clarification and also verification so that they were appropriately submitting applications to the right agency. And I wish I had done that sooner. Program officers can also alert you to things that you may not be aware of. So if there's a special emphasis notice that you might have missed, they may bring that to your attention and say, did you see this? You definitely want to consider this as part of your application. So your program officer who is assigned to you will be with you throughout your entire application, including until the point in which your funding ends. And so developing that relationship early on is really beneficial to you, especially as issues come up after you're funded, so that they know about your research, why it's important, and what you're trying to accomplish, so that they can be your advocate throughout the process. Previously funded work can be informative. We have this great, and you know, I'm going to jump out of the slides again and go to the website. We have this great database. Where's the... So the mouse is here, but I don't see the clicker. Well, maybe we won't be able to. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's go back. And let's go back to, so I hovered over funding and grants, and then if you'll see right below, it says gold. And this is an amazing database that we have specific to AHRQ research. And one of the most valuable things here is that you can search to find out who has been funded through AHRQ. So someone who's been funded in PCOR, you can search PCOR, and it'll pull up everybody who's been funded in PCOR. Maybe you're interested in, as earlier the discussion, HPV. You type in HPV, you find out who's been funded in HPV. Now what will show up will be the PI of that funded grant, the type of funding announcement that they applied for, the institution where they're at, and their abstract. And that information is really valuable because what you may find is that they have an interesting method or a clinical topic that's of interest to you. And you may want to reach out to them and ask them, would you be willing to talk to me about your research? Would you be willing to review my application to give me feedback? Would you be willing to share with me your application, your funded application, so I can see what that looks like? So this database provides you with, and I love that it's called gold because it's like this golden egg of a resource for you as you're preparing your research proposal. Again, I didn't know about this prior to that, so I wish I had. So you want to consult with senior investigators regarding grantsmanship. One of the biggest issues that we have with grant applications that come in is poor grantsmanship. So poor spelling, poor grammar. One that I just saw recently, it just cracks me up because, I mean, we all know, at least I know, when you submit a grant, it's usually that last minute hit submit, right, by the deadline because you're just constantly editing and trying to improve it and make it the best you can right before you submit it. But I recently saw one in which, just in their specific aims page, they had copied and pasted a nice paragraph that was like 3 or 4 sentences, and they accidentally hit paste 3 times. So that same paragraph is in 3 times and took up space that they probably could have used for other things. So you want to be careful with that to make sure that doesn't happen because, again, you know, that's using up space that you could have added additional information that would have been valuable for your proposal. But also, you have to consider your reviewers. Your reviewers are doing this on their own time. You want to make this as easy as possible for them. So if they have to work hard at reading through your proposal, you're making their job very challenging, which you would anticipate would have an impact on how they perceive your proposal, but also on your ability to carry out that proposal. So you want to put your best foot forward. Think of it as an interview. You want to shine. You want to make the case that you have an excellent program proposed and that you are the best person for this research. So some key points to promote success, the bottom line, the go, no-go. Priority populations are extremely important to include as part of your application. How are you specifically addressing the vulnerable populations and the specific and unique situations that occur? You want to address IRB and human subjects issues and data monitoring plans. Some common problems that we encounter that you want to consider prior to submitting your application and to address these is that there's no apparent translatability of research into practice or policy. So again, going back to that question of impact, what impact will your research make once it's funded, once it's done? How will it change practice? How will it change policy? Not that this isn't important, but in addition to submitting manuscripts and being published and presenting at conferences, truly, what is the impact on practice and policy, and how is that going to be made? Another common problem is that it's not unique to AHRQ or relevant to the mission or priorities. It's not uncommon that we have a PI who sends out their application to NIH. NIH gives them a poor score. It doesn't work. Then they turn around and send their application to AHRQ. They really don't change anything. I can't tell you how many cover letters I've received that still say NIH on the top, even though they're sending it to me at AHRQ. So be careful about that. Be thoughtful in terms of how your research really does relate to the mission and priorities of AHRQ, and make sure that your cover letter says AHRQ and not NIH or vice versa. The other problem, and I can't emphasize this enough, is grantsmanship issues. It truly is one of the biggest issues. How many people in here have served as reviewers, whether for NIH or AHRQ? Do you have any stories that you would like to share? Because this is such a huge issue. Ken, I'm sure you probably have something you could share with us.
Don't use my name.
Don't use my name.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the grantsmanship, I agree 100%. I mean, you're absolutely right. It really does make a difference. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of the people on the study sections are people like me. You know, they've been around for a while. Their eyes aren't that good. You know, when you submit a grant and it's 10 or 9 point font and it's just solid text,
Yeah.
You read a couple pages and think, oh, okay. Then you start skimming, you start,
Yeah.
where's the important stuff?
Exactly.
So the overall grantsmanship is really, really important. And paying attention, again, just to kind of reinforce your comment
Please.
about the 3 paragraphs. I had one the last cycle that I reviewed for, and I was reading through it, and all of a sudden there was a highlighted note in it, and it was like, SJ, please insert section 801. And so, when you read that, you think, okay, I'm probably spending more time on this application than they did. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
so it's not going to do well. So
It's not gonna-
those kind of simple mistakes, they sound trivial, but
They really make a difference. So, when a reviewer is reviewing your application, you can't guarantee that they're going to start with your application first thing in the morning when they're fresh and ready to go. It might be at night after work, and so the harder that you make it for them to read your application, it doesn't bode well for you. The other piece that I would like to emphasize in terms of grantsmanship is that you do address all those questions, the who, when, where, why, what. And what I found personally when writing grants is that it's easy to make assumptions, that everybody's going to know what I mean or what I imply. And you get caught up in your proposal and your research, and you get lost in this articulation of what's important because you feel like you're articulating it, but you're not. And so it's really important to have a second pair of eyes, a third pair of eyes, who aren't attached and as part of your team, who can answer those questions. At AHRQ specifically, this becomes really important because we don't have the clinical silos in terms of reviews of applications. And so someone who submits an application on women's health may not, you will have a reviewer who has expertise in women's health, but your entire team will not all be women's health. So you can't assume that your reviewers know everything about the state of the science on women's health. And so it's up to you to be able to articulate that, to make the case, to demonstrate all that information about your application. And so when I advise people on when they're creating their application, I always say assume that they know nothing. Assume that they have no expertise in the methods. Assume that they have no expertise in the clinical topic. Assume that they know nothing, which is not going to be the case. But if you go into writing your application with that mindset, you're more likely to cover all those key questions and avoid having your reviewer state that this isn't clear or I don't get this. So that's really important. And Ken, do you feel the same way about that as a reviewer?
oh yes, absolutely. I mean, every reviewer has little pet peeves. I mean, my pet peeve is acronyms.
Acronyms, yeah.
Acronyms, when you think about why you use acronyms, you use acronyms if you're a writer to make it easier for you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it easier for the reader. So
Correct.
you should really avoid overusing acronyms.
Yeah.
I realize you can save space doing that, but you really have to be careful about using acronyms.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say would be the max 3 acronyms to use throughout an application?
Yeah, I usually tell people only use acronyms that your grandmother would know. That's somebody that are very commonly understood. Don't use acronyms that are specific to your field and your discipline and your area of research.
Yeah.
Because just as you said, there will be people on the study section that don't have that kind of background, that aren't familiar with it.
Correct. Correct. And as a program officer, when applications come in, I actually read the applications from cover to cover, and I go through and I score them as if I'm the reviewer. And one of the things that I noticed, speaking of acronyms, I'm glad that you brought that up, is that if I'm reading an article or an application on, let's say, neurology, something in neurology. Well, my expertise is not neurology, and they're throwing all these acronyms in, and at some point I have to go back to the beginning to find out what does this acronym mean again, and then start over again. And so I can imagine as a reviewer that becomes challenging if you're being thrown lots of acronyms because you get lost in that. Yes?
Can you comment on the last?
I'm going to. Yep, most definitely. So any other questions about grantsmanship? Okay. So the last items, another common problem is it's not interprofessional with diverse clinical, physician, nursing, pharmacy, etc., and or research, epidemiology, psychology backgrounds at all levels, PI to data collection. So let's break this down. I think this is a really important point. As research funding decreases, federal research funding decreases, we're becoming more focused on impact in terms of where the funding dollars go. We want to ensure that the teams, the research teams, are very interprofessional, that we're not just supporting an all-physician team or an all-nursing team or an all-pharmacy team, but rather a team of professionals. And if we think about healthcare today, it's a team approach to care, and so our research should also be reflective of that. And so when we think about diverse clinical areas, we're not talking about the pediatrician, the neurologist, the OBGYN as being diverse, but rather having a diverse team that represents physicians, nursing, and pharmacy, representing different disciplines. We also want different research backgrounds. And so again, epidemiology, psychology, nursing, pharmacy, and so forth is part of that team. And then the other piece that comes up quite frequently, that's a little bit of an issue, is that the backgrounds are at all levels. So a common issue that we see is that it's really top heavy. So they'll have an all physician or all nursing team at the top, the PIs, the co-PIs, the directors of the big components of the project. And then they trickle down, and these other diverse areas are these other little pieces. So probably the most common one that we see is physicians are the head of the project, and then they have nurses collecting the data or implementing the intervention, and they're indicating that we have this great team of diversity. Well, what we want to see, if you're going to do that, is where's your PhD prepared nurse who's also at the top as part of the core of your team. And that's true also for nursing. So if you have nursing as the core top of your team, and you have, let's say, social workers and physicians at various pieces at the bottom, not that it's a hierarchy, but for the purposes of this example, where are those folks at the top of your team also at that research level to be really integrated into that piece? And so that becomes really, really important. And we do make funding decisions based on that to ensure that that diversity does exist, both clinical diversity, research diversity, and ensuring that these folks are at all levels of the project.
Did I answer your question?
But you don't mean that the research assistants that are collecting the data have to be from different backgrounds?
No, it's your entire team. So when you think about your entire team, making sure that you have your diverse backgrounds in place, and that are appropriate too, right? So I was at a site visit earlier this week, and I can't remember the project, but there was a question about, well, I see that you have pharmacy as an example, but I just can't see how pharmacy would fit into my project. Well, these are just examples. It has to be appropriate. It has to be appropriate for your study. If pharmacy shouldn't be a part of it, then don't try to force pharmacy to be a part of it. Be thoughtful in who you bring to your team. And we do have time for questions, because you didn't ask a lot of questions throughout the presentation.
Yes, sir.
So for the dissertation grants, I don't know much about those, but what is the sort of the timeline on those? Can students apply for those while they're in the middle of their dissertation?
Yeah.
Or how does
That is such a great question, because that was a huge issue for me. So for me personally, when I was in my PhD program, I was debating whether I wanted to apply for an NIH NERSA grant or an AHRQ dissertation grant. And the hallmark components of the AHRQ dissertation grant is that you have to have completed your coursework. And for me, personally, for my research, I was at a point where I was already ready to move forward, and I didn't want a gap between completing the coursework and starting my dissertation, because my prelims, my preliminary examinations, and then my presentation was going to occur the day after my coursework was done, because I was ready at that point. So for me, the dissertation grant didn't work for me, because I wanted a seamless transition from being a pre-doc funding on a T32 going straight into funding for my dissertation. So if I had waited, completed my coursework, submitted a dissertation grant, I may have waited an entire year before I would have had the funding to start my dissertation. Whereas the NIH NERSA funding for me personally worked better, because I could apply within my last year of my doctoral coursework, so that as soon as I was done with that, I seamlessly transitioned into my F31 for my dissertation funding. But the AHRQ dissertation grant, the primary piece is that you have to have completed your coursework before you apply. you have to be a U.S. citizen, and you have to be in a current doctoral program that it's accredited. This would be it. And then it's health services research. So my research fit perfectly in that criteria. It was just the timing in terms of coursework and where I was personally at in terms of moving my research forward. And so you have to make those decisions, but there's lots of opportunities. Yeah.
So Jennifer, maybe you could talk a little bit about the study sections and the CSR study sections versus the AHRQ study sections.
Sure, go ahead. From your perspective. Please.
Well, I'm assuming AHRQ, you use the CSR study sections as well, right? Or do you just use AHRQ studies?
We use AHRQ study sections.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even though the grants go to NIH and they're in the system and they're in ERA Commons,
Yeah.
when somebody submits something to AHRQ, they don't say, well, please assign my application to the, CIB.
No.
H
Yep,
study
exactly.
section. That's a CSR study section. They all are reviewed by
An AHRQ study
AHRQ
section.
study.
Yep. If you're submitting to an AHRQ funding announcement, you will be reviewed by an AHRQ review panel.
And are there, on the webpage, I'm assuming, is there a list like there is in the CSR webpage?
There are.
The study section,
There are.
Study section members.
Exactly. There's a listing of the members of the particular study sections. Just like with NIH, in your cover letter, you can suggest a particular study section, just as you can include in your cover letter potential people who are on the study section that you may have a conflict of interest with and that you do not want to have reviewing your application. So that opportunity does exist for you. But going back to the point of your application goes to NIH, it really is for administrative purposes. So instead of AHRQ paying for the development of its own grant application processing system, why reinvent the wheel when we can outsource it to NIH? NIH can process it for us to the extent that it receives it through their ERA Commons, and then essentially just kicks it straight to us. And then once we receive it, we look at eligibility issues, we look at program officer appointment, and then we also look at assignment to study section and assignment to specific reviewers within that study section.
But then once it's reviewed, then the summary statements and the information gets posted back on the ERA Commons.
Correct.
And an individual can go in there and look the stuff up just like you would for an NIH.
Correct. It provides us the platform to interact with the PIs who are submitting the applications with our agency without creating a new program. And it works really well because folks are used to submitting NIH grants, and we use the same components of a grant application, so it's nice and seamless. We use NIH's BioSketch, so you don't have to create a separate BioSketch for AHRQ. It really does allow for efficiency for both the PI but also for AHRQ in terms of our grants.
So I'm assuming you're making the change to the new talking about BioSketch, you're making the change to the new BioSketch form.
Correct.
in May?
Everything, yep. Yes, sir.
So AHRQ and PCORI then, they're two different entities, independent from each other, etc. So assuming that the topic of the application is of interest, fits both PCORI and the PCORI section of AHRQ, would it be okay to submit the same application to both places at the same time?
So I'm going to clarify one point that you made, and then I'll answer that question. So the first piece is that PCORI is the institute, so the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. AHRQ does not have a PCORI. We have PCOR funds from the Trust Fund. That's a part of the Affordable Care Act. Our PCOR funds are dedicated to training and dissemination. You will not see PCOR funds used for such as R01s and R21s. As part of the Affordable Care Act, we're not allowed to do that. PCORI, the institute, is the one who's charged for producing those funding announcements and those opportunities. So PCORI is funded through the Affordable Care Act through federal funds. AHRQ is a federal agency, just as NIH is a federal agency. Many of our funding announcements indicate criteria that are specific to whether or not you've been funded with PCORI or NIH in the past and the level of funding that you've received. There's also guidance for each of the funding announcements as to whether or not you can submit simultaneously or not. Definitely never with an NIH grant. With PCORI has so many program-related applications questions, then I think it's best to talk to your program officer specifically about which PCORI announcement you're considering versus AHRQ. Because what you might be looking at is PCORI has a lot of program announcements as opposed to research announcements. And so if you submit there and then also submit a research project to AHRQ, there may not be that overlap. But again, you need to speak specifically with your program officer and to share those details so that they can give you guidance on how to proceed. Yep. You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Does AHRQ support research on methods? Like if I were looking at a way to study health services using one qualitative method versus another, is that something that you guys support?
So it's really hard to answer any question related to do we support X, do we support Y. The best advice I can give you is to draft up a specific aims page, just as if you were going to submit the application, and send it to a program officer and have them give you give a review and feedback to you about whether or not this fits within our mission and priorities, and if it would be something that we would be specifically interested in. 2 of the special emphasis notices that I pointed out on the webpage really are focused on methods and finding out information related to efficiency, affordability, and things like that. So that might be something that would fit within that, but without seeing your specific aims page, it's really hard to know whether that's something that we would consider. Again, having those details are really helpful when answering those questions.